There are still over 2 years left until MotoGP makes its major regulation change in 2027, but there is a change potentially coming for next year that could be more important than it sounds. A new front tire is being worked on by series supplier Michelin, and if that sounds run-of-the-mill, it is not. It is exactly the kind of change that can decide champions, change the style of racing, revitalize careers, potentially end careers. But before we get to all of that, Simon, why is it time for a new front tire?
Well, it goes back to this problem that we've been having for the best part of a season and a half now, related to front tyre pressures ever since the new rules regarding them were brought in midway through the 2023 season. Essentially, Michelin were getting concerned that some riders and teams were starting races with tyre pressures that were too low. So they brought in a rule that said you have to be above a certain minimum pressure for a certain percentage of the race. And the penalty right now for failing to adhere to that is a 16-second time penalty that, as we've seen, is enough to essentially demote someone from a podium to out of the points if you're unlucky enough. The reason that the teams are running the pressures like this is also pretty straightforward. It's because the current tyre can't cope with the range of pressures that comes from the added force that modern MotoGP bikes are putting on the front rubber. We have ride height devices, we have aerodynamics that these tyres weren't designed to cope with, and as such there tends to be a huge fluctuation during races. You essentially have to predict what sort of race you're going to have before the race starts right now. You have to try and work out if you're going to have clean air in front of you so that you can start with a pressure that's a little bit higher, or you can try and start with a really low pressure, expecting to be in the pack and knowing that the effort of racing against others and following other bikes in the hot air that they're producing is going to raise your pressure. Because you don't want that pressure to go too high. The riders say that when that happens, it's essentially like riding on ice. It becomes too slippery. So it's a fine margin. It's one that no one likes. And it's one that essentially has to be fixed right now by Michelin bringing a new front tyre that's more designed to cope with these extra forces and more stable across the range of pressures that it can potentially be forced to cope with in a race.
Now, as you said, penalties are 16 seconds for an infraction right now. Last year, when the rule was introduced, they were a bit more lenient, but that was because of the mid-season nature of the introduction. I believe last year, the limit was at 188 bar, and a lot of people were falling foul, even though that's a limit that you don't have to adhere for the entire race, just for a share of laps. So that also, I think, gives you an idea of how variable the tire pressure is during the race, depending on the conditions. I guess you could say now that it's been lowered to, I believe, 180 bar, you go, well, just follow that rule and that's fine. But I think there's a general feeling in MotoGP that this is not really tenable, both in terms of, the penalties potentially deciding races and championships and what have you, and in terms of the racing it creates.
I think it's not even the penalties that's the problem right now, because people kind of know how to ride around it at this stage. And riders are they've all got systems set up so that they get a warning on their dashboard to tell them what they need to do, which is occasionally why you see some people, essentially pulling over for no reason mid-race and a bit confusingly, and then you realize, it's probably tire pressures, like I think we saw Fabio Di Giannantonio do, most notably in Assen a few races ago. But the bigger problem is essentially that we don't want people managing tyres this way during races. We want them racing each other. There's an element of conservatism that riders have had to adopt because they're constantly thinking about this. That's something that was never intended by Michelin or by anyone else, especially series organisers Dorna, who at the end of the day are here to put on a show. So the end result is that we need to do something to fix it, to try and get back to better motorbike racing every weekend.
Ultimately, when you hear, a fight for the lead that goes for 2 laps and then the guy behind goes, and then my front tire pressure went up and I could not follow anymore, that stinks, doesn't it? That's the whole point. Prototype tires were tested at Misano in the Monday test after the Grand Prix. It was a mandatory 30-minute window, I believe. It's important that it was a mandatory window, because if you make it optional, riders and teams do not do it. We've learned time and time again. Here's a quote from Michelin Motorsport, two-wheel motorsport boss Piero Taramasso. The aim for this tire is to give more grip, better feedback, also be less sensitive to pressure and temperature variation. The majority of the riders liked it. Of course, it took 2-3 laps to get the feeling. After that, riders started to push, and they reported to us that the grip level was good, feedback, stability, especially in the fast corners. And Taramasa described himself as very satisfied. Simon, I think, we've heard from the riders, and I think that the description of the majority being generally quite happy was accurate. But there is one guy who's more happy than the others.
So I think the kind of consensus word used by a lot of riders to describe the new tyre, at least initially, was probably strange. A lot complained about the feeling that it has just as you tip into the corner, that it tends to go a bit kind of weightless and a bit lack of feeling just as you're tipping in, which isn't the most confidence-inspiring sensation and is something that a lot of them is going to take some time getting used to. That was pretty universal across the grid, apart from really one person in particular. The only guy that absolutely loved this tyre, and it is a huge worry to everyone else in the grid, is reigning world champion Pecco Bagnaia, who straight up said that this is a tyre that lets him ride the motorbike the way he wants to do it. It's all about the stability on braking with this tyre. I think, whenever we asked him about it after the race, he said, I love it, and it's something that I've really needed. I'm a rider who uses the brakes a lot to enter the corner, and with this tyre, that was super good. It's more difficult to change direction, more heavy, but I like a lot the grip and the way you can push with this tyre. I was braking like a devil. The problem with this tyre we have right now is that I can't brake like I want because the front is collapsing. With the new tyre, I have much more margin. He even admitted that he had essentially picked a couple of corners on the track where he wasn't afraid to crash to really try and push this tyre into folding on him, and it didn't do it. That's how much confidence he was able to find right away with this. Now, obviously, the rest of the grid are going to find a bit more of that as time progresses and are going to close up a little bit. But I think the fact that he's already got a motorbike that's designed for his riding style and now has a tyre that complements it rather than having to be significantly altered in any way to fit the bike is just, it's music to his ears, and it might sound like we're over-exaggerating this a little bit, but it is really hard to describe just how happy Bagnaia was whenever we were sitting in front of him talking to him about this. He had a proper gleam in his eye that looked like someone that had just found a really significant psychological advantage over the rest of the grid ahead of the start of next season.
And for context, it is necessary to note, because that is the question everybody will have. Marc Marquez, happy enough, but not this level of like delirious joy to any sort of level. And we this sounds innocuous, right? It's a tire change, but we've seen tire changes even recently. You do not have to go far, having a massive impact. In 2020, Michelin brought a new rear. Andrea Dovizioso couldn't make it work for himself. You could argue that in Marquez's absence, that cost him his best shot at a Premier Class title. This year, they brought again a new Michelin rear, lap records being demolished everywhere. Ducati struggled with vibrations on it for the first half of the season, was beatable, then figured it out, and now is exploiting it better than anybody else. But it has, for instance, Marco Bezzecchi, a standout from last year who does not want the extra rear grip it offers, but, can't get away from it. So is struggling at all. These are career-changing things. We've spoken, though, about riders currently on the grid, Simon, but I've brought up to you, and I know you're more skeptical than I am, but it's an interesting topic to discuss. There is a rider off the grid for who this might be interesting.
Yeah. You've got a theory, Val, that the World Superbike Championship leader Toprak Razgatlioglu is going to really want to try this tyre because he's someone who brakes hard in a straight line. I would be very curious to see that as well. Unfortunately, it's not something that's going to happen in 2025, as much as we can hope that it might. But this should be, if this tyre progresses the way that we are hearing right now that it is, then this should be another element that convinces him or helps convince him that he should be looking at a MotoGP move, because arguably this is the right time to do it. This is an opportunity to jump onto something that's going to be even more suited to his style than arguably it would be previously, because traditionally this isn't how you've raced a MotoGP bike. This super hard braking, squaring off the corner and accelerating out with the bike upright as quickly as possible is something that's come about as a result of the ride-height devices and the aerodynamics, essentially making bikes more stable than ever on corner entry. It's part of the reason why we're seeing Honda with, a bike that has traditionally been super short and nimble suffering, and why we're seeing Yamaha with a bike that could carry corner speed and just smooth out that acceleration and exit struggling. it's something that in theory should suit Toprak's riding style. And yeah, I think, everyone was already excited to see him try and get a chance to jump on a modern MotoGP bike for a proper test, for a proper season, and see what could come of it. And I think this is even more motivation for him, or at least it should be.